September 3rd, 1943, 2:11 a.m. North Atlantic, Convoy HX-208. The night was so black it seemed to swallow the horizon whole. No moon, no stars. Just a wet, endless void, broken only by the low, shuddering churn of 57 merchant ships forcing their way through the North Atlantic in tight, nervous formation. Wind clawed across the decks at 38 knots, spraying cold needles of seawater that stung exposed skin. Below, the swells rose and fell like dark, breathing giants. Inside the radar hut of the USS Kittiwake, Radioman's second class, Eli Mercer, leaned over his Type 286 radar console, the room lit only by the thin, trembling halo of emergency red lamps. The equipment hummed with a constant 600 Hz transformer whine, a sound every operator eventually learned to ignore everyone except Eli, who could tell when that hum drifted even a fraction. The radar display flickered softly, its phosphor surface glowing a ghostly green as the antenna swept through another rotation. For hours, nothing. Just thermal noise, sea clutter, and the occasional false return smeared across the baseline. The kind of night where even veteran operators started doubting their own eyes. At 2 hours, 11 minutes and 34 seconds, 6, the war tried to whisper. A spike, thin, sharp, surgical. Then a second one, 0.006 seconds later. Eli froze. Most men would have missed it entirely. The pulse spacing was too tight, too small, too easy to dismiss as static jitter. But Eli felt it the way a musician hears a wrong note, the way a mechanic feels a torque shift before the wrench slips. That wasn't clutter. His headphones crackled with a faint, doubled heartbeat, tap-tap, a micro-delay so impossibly subtle that instructors insisted it was beneath human perception. But after months tuning drifting oscillators by ear, Eli knew better. His pulse quickened, his fingertips tingled with cold adrenaline. He adjusted the gain, dropping it by 11 decibels to clear the noise floor. The spike remained, the second echo remained, perfectly symmetrical. Which meant only one thing. A submerged object, shifting layers in the thermocline. Eli's breath fogged inside the cramped compartment. He knew the physics. Radar couldn't penetrate water, but it could reflect off a pressure-deformed surface. No wave, no bird, no spray pattern made a 6-millisecond echo. Only a steel hull, descending at just the right angle, just the right depth. Beneath the convoy, 3 U-boats, U-610, U-584, U-221, were sliding into attack formation, moving at 3.1 knots, stalking through the blackness, like wolves closing on a wounded herd. Torpedoes were minutes away from launch. Eli reached for the talkback key. His hand shook. "Bridge, I've got something. Bearing 047. And, sir," he swallowed, "it's moving." For a heartbeat, the ship continued as if nothing had happened. The wind, the engines, the distant clatter of chains. Then the captain's voice came back, tight and skeptical. "Confirm your contact, Mercer." But he couldn't. Not with the doctrine they'd been taught. Not with equipment the brass insisted couldn't see what he'd just seen. Still, he whispered, "Sir, this is real. What happened in the next 6 minutes would save 19,480 sailors across 4 convoys and rewrite Allied anti-submarine protocols." But at that moment, alone in the dark with a flickering screen and a 0.006-second ghost, no one believed him. The basement workshop smelled of warm dust, hot solder, and old bakelite. Shelves sagged under the weight of surplus radio parts. Cracked dials, mismatched coils, vacuum tubes that glowed a deep orange when you brought them back from the dead. It was the kind of place customers walked into, expecting to talk to the owner, the gruff, big-bellied man up front, but instead found one 8-year-old Eli Mercer, quiet as a church mouse, hunched over a chassis like he was listening to something inside it breathe. Most customers talked around him, not to him. They'd say things like, "Kid, hand me that meter," or, "Tell your boss, this set is still drifting," while Eli sat perfectly still, head tilted, listening to the soft, warbling beat frequency oscillation coming from a mismatched crystal pair inside a battered Philco receiver. Where others saw broken circuits, Eli heard personalities. He could tell when a 455 kHz intermediate frequency stage was drifting 200 Hz, not by the needle on a meter, but by the way the harmonic shimmered against the carrier. He could sense when a transformer's ferrite screw had shifted 2.7 centimeters left of its resonance sweet spot, changing the whole character of the audio. Senior technicians called it intuition. Eli called it listening. One winter evening, after the shop closed and the owner's boots clomped up the stairs, Eli stayed behind, a habit he developed the moment he first touched a soldering iron. Outside, snowflakes drifted across the alley, catching the weak yellow light from the workshop window. In the alley sat a dented metal bucket someone had forgotten months ago, rust creeping up its sides. Eli pointed an experimental transmitter toward it, nothing more than a hacked-together oscillator pushing a pulse toward the alley wall. The echo that returned carried a strange delay. Not long, not large, just a tiny afterbeat. 5 to 7 milliseconds. He heard it instantly. He tapped the transformer, adjusted the coil, and listened again. The bucket reflection produced a second ghost tone so faint most technicians wouldn't detect it even with headphones. The delay changed when he moved the bucket an inch, just 1 inch. His heart raced. What he'd found wasn't noise, it was pattern. An echo inside an echo. He recorded the timing in a small paper notebook, the same one he'd later carry across the Atlantic. He didn't know what it meant, not really, but he knew what everyone else told him. Son, nobody can hear sub-10 millisecond delays. Not physically possible. Eli just smiled, shy and unsure whether to correct them. Because he could hear it. He could hear the world's smallest delays, the faintest shifts, the quietest clues. And 5 years later, in the black waters of the North Atlantic, that impossible skill would be the only reason a convoy survived the night. But in that cramped basement, surrounded by glowing tubes and the faint smell of ozone, no one cared. No one thought it mattered. Not yet. November 1st, 1942, 9:03 a.m. Liverpool Naval HQ. The briefing room felt colder than the North Atlantic itself. A damp chill seeped through the stone walls as officers shuffled in, boots echoing against the floor. Outside, the docks clanged with activity cranes, groaning, cables snapping taut, ships limping into harbor with hulls torn open like broken tin cans. But inside this room, nothing made noise except the thick pages of casualty reports being unfolded. Across a long table, a massive chart lay pinned under brass weights. Black grease pencil lines marked convoy routes. Red slashes marked where ships had vanished. It looked less like a map and more like a sheet of old film scratched by something with claws. The Battle of the Atlantic had entered its bloodiest phase. Convoys were being hit so fast that some escorts never even saw the periscope wakes. A commander stabbed his finger at the red lines. HX-204. Lost in under 20 minutes, he barked. 3 escorts present. None detected the Wolfpack until the torpedoes were already in the water. He threw down the report. Gentlemen, this is untenable. Engineers blamed their radar. Magnetrons were drifting Q factors, dropping 12–17% in just a few hours. Radar operators reported phantom spikes between 0.004 and 0.009 seconds. Tiny jitter readings so inconsistent that headquarters dismissed them as artifacts. Meteorologists pointed to temperature inversions, warm layers over cold ones refracting signals at 1826 meters depth, confusing returns. Sonar crews swore they heard metallic clanks echoes from depths no U-boat should survive but had nothing to prove it. Every specialist had a theory. None had an answer. At the far edge of the table, unnoticed by most, sat Eli Mercer, recently transferred from U.S. training to assist with Allied radar operations in the Atlantic Theater. His uniform wasn't decorated. His rank meant nothing here, but his ears picked up the details others glossed over. He listened as the officers argued. Type 271 sets half their range gone overnight. It's the sea clutter, nothing more. No Wolfpack coordination is tightening. Enigma decrypts show them moving in groups of 9. And our escorts? Blind. We need better operators. Eli leaned forward. Sir, what about the timing of the phantom echoes? They're consistent. A lieutenant waved him off. Those are noise artifacts. Operator error. Not actionable. Eli closed his mouth. The room wasn't interested in subtlety. It wanted certainty, something bold. Big fixes, big theories, big solutions. Not millisecond irregularities. Not a whisper inside the static. Yet the numbers haunted him. If the radar was showing spikes at 0.004 to 0.009 seconds, it meant something was refracting the signal, something with mass, something moving beneath the surface layers. But no one listened. No one believed precision could matter when ships were disappearing by the dozens. And with convoy losses exceeding 800,000 tons per month, the Allies were desperate for answers. Any answers except the one Eli was quietly trying to offer. He looked again at the shredded map. The Atlantic wasn't just bleeding steel. It was bleeding men, thousands of them, swallowed whole, because the experts had decided that the smallest anomalies meant nothing. But Eli knew better. Sometimes the war didn't shout. Sometimes it whispered. Aboard HMS Truro, radar training room. The training room felt like the inside of a boiler, humid, cramped, and buzzing with the electrical heartbeat of half-serviced radar consoles. Chalk dust hung in the air like a thin fog. The walls were plastered with diagrams of pulse widths, antenna sweep patterns, and magnetron maintenance notes. Tonight's lesson was supposed to be simple. Identifying surface clutter versus genuine contacts. The instructor, a sharp-tongued petty officer with a permanent scowl, paced in front of the class. "Remember," he barked, tapping the blackboard with a pointer. "Equipment jitter creates false spikes. You ignore anything under 10 milliseconds." Eli Mercer felt something twist in his gut. He raised a hand. "Permission to speak, sir?" A sigh. "What is it, Mercer?" Eli stood, palms sweating, feeling the eyes of 20 trainees settle on him. "Sir, I've been seeing double echoes, spaced between 0.005 and 0.007 seconds. They're consistent, not random." A few trainees smirked. Jitter was the oldest boogeyman for novices. Any odd blip, and someone blamed jitter. The instructor crossed his arms. "And what do you believe is causing these double echoes?" Eli walked to the chalkboard, grabbed a stick of chalk, and drew 2 vertical pulse lines. "Sir, if the double return spacing is 0.006 seconds, then..." He scribbled quickly, chalk tapping in nervous bursts. 0.006 seconds times 343 meters per second equals 2.058 meters. He circled it. "That distance change isn't surface clutter. It's too symmetrical. It behaves like a reflection bouncing off something submerged. A metallic hull, shifting layers under the thermocline." Silence. A long, uncomfortable one. Then laughter. Not cruel, worse. Dismissive. A trainee whispered loudly, "Subs showing up on radar? What's next? Sonar picking up airplanes." The instructor shook his head. "Mercer, radar cannot penetrate water." "It doesn't need to," Eli insisted. "Sometimes, the pulse reflects off the surface after a submarine distorts it. A pressure wave. A deformation. Just a millimeter or two." The instructor stepped closer, his tone icy. "You are describing fantasy physics. If this were real, the Admiralty would have published it years ago." Eli felt his cheeks burn, his throat tightened. "But the numbers are meaningless," the instructor snapped. "Return to your seat." Eli obeyed, chalk still dusting his fingertips. He sank into his chair, heartbeat pounding louder than the transformer hum. The others were already whispering, jokes passing around the room. Yet, while they laughed, something else was happening, something no one there could appreciate. Outside, beneath the cold Atlantic layers, U-boats did distort the surface. They did create micro-reflections. And the 2.058-meter displacement Eli had calculated was nearly identical to the trim angle shift of a diving submarine. But because no radar manual mentioned subsurface echoes, because no instructor had ever seen one, because no one believed the war could hinge on something measured in milliseconds, Eli was dismissed, overlooked, forgotten. What happened next would change everything, but in this moment, alone in a room full of operators who thought he'd lost the plot, Eli Mercer felt the sting of early genius ignored. And the war kept bleeding, because the one boy who heard what machines missed had not yet been heard himself. May 2nd, 1943, 1:14 p.m. Admiralty Signals Division. London. Rain hammered the windows of the Admiralty's Signals Division like impatient fingers demanding answers. Inside, the air smelled of old wool and pipe smoke. Brass plaques lined the hallway. Portraits of decorated officers stared down with unblinking judgment. This was the nerve center of naval communication, where ideas lived or died depending on who spoke them. Today, Eli Mercer had come alone. He held in his hand a neatly typed memo, the most important document he had ever written. Utilization of micro-echo spacing to detect submerged U-boats within 800 meters. His knees trembled as he entered the conference room. Admirals and senior captains sat behind a long oak table, polished to a mirror sheen. These were men who had commanded fleets, men who had weathered storms of steel and fire. Eli, barely 22, felt like he had walked into a cathedral of authority. A captain skimmed the memo, brow furrowing. Radar cannot detect submarines, Radioman Mercer. Water absorbs electromagnetic pulses. Eli swallowed. Respectfully, sir, the radar pulse doesn't enter the water. It reflects off a deformed surface layer above the submarine. A pressure wave. Another officer cut him off. Science fiction. Eli pressed on. I have logged consistent return intervals, 0.0054, 0.006, 0.0061, 0.0058 seconds. The symmetry implies a operator error. An older rear admiral barked without looking up. You've misunderstood the fundamentals. Eli felt heat rise behind his eyes. Sir, with respect, the pattern occurs only when a submerged object shifts depth. The admiral tossed the memo onto the table like it was contaminated. If this were real, someone important would have found it. That sentence hit harder than any torpedo. Someone important. Not a quiet boy from New Jersey, not a radio man without rank or pedigree. Eli's voice thinned. But men are dying. Convoys. Thank you, Radioman, the lead captain interrupted. Dismissed. And that was it. A door closed on the one idea that might have changed the course of the Atlantic months earlier. Eli left the room feeling smaller than when he'd entered. In the hallway, he leaned against the cold stone wall, breath shaking. His memo, his last attempt to be heard, was already being buried under stacks of bureaucratic paperwork. But even as doubt gnawed at him, even as he wondered whether he truly was the foolish dreamer they believed him to be, he clung to one truth. The ocean was whispering something. He had heard it, and he would not let silence win. Destroyer Escort Test Cell, Belfast Dockyard. The test cell was a cavern of metal shadows, lit by the occasional flicker of arc lamps fighting the damp Irish air. At this hour, the dockyard was quiet. No riveters hammering, no cranes groaning, only the distant lap of black water against steel hulls. Most men slept. Eli Mercer did not. He stood alone beside a crude test setup, a signal generator struggling to maintain stable output, a reflector plate angled with jury-rigged clamps, and a rectangular water tank that had seen better decades. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion and obsession. If no one believed his theory, he would prove it himself. He fired the pulse. A crisp click, a reflected blip, and then a faint secondary echo. But was it measurable? He adjusted the frequency, tuned the pulse width to 2 microseconds, increased magnetron stability to within plus or minus 0.8%, the best he could coax from salvaged parts. The water in the tank rippled gently as he submerged a metal block just beneath the surface. Again, the pulse. Again, the echo. Then Eli saw it. A spike. Then another spike, 6 milliseconds later. His breath caught. He repeated the test. Same delay. He measured the deformation on the water surface, 1.03 to 1.12 millimeters, barely perceptible to the naked eye. But the radar pulse, striking this subtly lifted patch of surface, reflected differently. It created a micro-echo, a secondary signature. A tiny deformation translating into a measurable deltat equals 2d divided by c delay. Eli calculated the displacement. It matched the spacing he had seen at sea. He stared at the oscilloscope, heart pounding in his chest like a depth charge about to explode. He wasn't imagining things. He wasn't misreading jitter. He had found the physics no one else bothered to look for. Footsteps approached. A tank technician, arriving early for his shift, stopped in the doorway. "What have you got there, Mercer?" Eli stepped aside, letting him see the trace. The technician blinked. "Run that again." Eli did. The same twin spike appeared perfect, rhythmic, undeniable. What happened next, the technician whispered, is going to shock a lot of people. For the first time, someone besides Eli had witnessed the 0.006-second ghost. And for the first time, Eli felt the beginnings of hope. September 3rd, 1943, 2:11 a.m. Convoy HX-208. The fog rolled across the Atlantic like a living thing, thick, suffocating, smothering the horizon, until the world shrank to a gray cocoon around each vessel. Even the moon refused to shine. The convoy's diesel engines throbbed like anxious hearts, their vibrations carried across the swells. Every lookout strained into the void, but they might as well have been staring into wet concrete. This was the kind of night U-boats prayed for. At 2:06, aboard the USS Kittiwake, Eli Mercer leaned so close to the radar scope that the green glow tinted his face. He adjusted the gain, fingers dancing over the dials. He had learned to listen not just with his ears, but with his skin, the subtle shift in the console's hum, the tremor of the display when the magnetron caught something it wasn't supposed to. And then he saw it. A microspike. Then another. 6 of them in 35 seconds. Each spaced between 0.0058 and 0.006 seconds. Eli's mouth went dry. He scribbled the timings, plotted drift on a transparency sheet laid over the screen. The spikes weren't staying still, they were sliding across the bearing indicator at 0.14 degrees per second, a signature of movement deeper than any surface wave. Submarines weren't just present, they were maneuvering, closing. He keyed the bridge. Captain, contact is subsurface. Multiple, forming a pattern. The captain hesitated. Doctrine said radar could not detect submerged U-boats. Doctrine said nighttime fog masked everything. But Eli's voice crackled with something the captain had learned to trust. Fear wrapped in certainty. Sir, they're at 470 meters, diving to attack depth 20, maybe 30 meters down. A tremor rolled under the ship, the faint wake of something massive passing beneath the thermocline. Then another. Then closer, a metallic groan reverberated through the hull, like steel exhaling. The Wolfpack was rising into firing position. The captain muttered, "God help us," then barked, "Ready depth charges." Crew scrambled. Boots pounded the deck. The ship heaved as men loaded 200-pound Mark 7 charges, fuses set between 50 and 100 feet. The first charge dropped. A muffled whomp vibrated through the hull. Then a second. Then a third. At 2:13 a.m., the sea erupted. A column of black water shot skyward as a shockwave slammed into the convoy, rattling every bolt aboard the Kittiwake. Moments later, a distant groan metal collapsing inward rose from the depths. A U-boat's hull had given out. One down. The others panicked. Their Wolfpack formation shattered as they dove steeply to escape the concussive blasts. Without coordinated attack, their firing solutions failed. Torpedoes launched prematurely veered off course, detonating harmlessly in empty water. The convoy survived. Officers would later say the victory was luck. But the men who saw Eli that night, his white-knuckled grip on the console, the sweat on his brow, the terror in his eyes, knew better. It wasn't luck. It was a boy who heard what machines missed. The conference room at Naval Operations hummed with a different kind of tension, not fear, but astonishment. Reports from Convoy HX-208 spread across the long walnut table like a fan of improbable evidence. Diagrams, echo logs, survivor statements, triangulation sketches, and at the center, the tracing paper where Eli Mercer had plotted the drift of those 6 microspikes. The room filled with murmurs. How did he see this? 6 milliseconds. There's no margin for error there. Is this reproducible? A physicist from the Naval Research Lab tapped the table. Gentlemen, we replicated it in test tanks. His readings matched displacement models within 1 millimeter. That quiet sentence detonated through the room more explosively than any depth charge. What happened next stunned even Eli. A rush order went out to every radar school in the Atlantic Theater. Watch for 0.005-0.007-second double echoes, log all occurrences. Factories were instructed to ramp up production of improved gain amplifiers, 60,000 units, over the next 6 months. Engineers retrofitted escort ships with new analog delay line filters capable of separating microechoes from clutter. boosting detection reliability by 2.4 times. Training protocols were rewritten overnight. What had once been dismissed as fantasy physics became Echo Pattern 6 Alpha, an official naval standard. But the revolution didn't end in the classroom. It spread through the shipyards, welders, machinists, and radar technicians assembling racks of equipment by the hour. Conveyor belts roared, magnetrons thumped. The smell of oil and solder filled the air as workers labored under floodlights. And at sea, something extraordinary happened. Convoys began reporting early warnings. Depth charges fell sooner. Wolfpacks mistimed their attacks. Where ships once vanished into the Atlantic without witnesses, now they survived. The tactical pendulum was shifting. For the first time since the U-boat menace began, the Allies weren't running blind into the dark, they were peering back. All because a young radioman refused to accept that the smallest echoes meant nothing. Eli never asked for recognition. In fact, he was stunned by how quickly the Admiralty moved. But fewer ships sinking meant fewer telegrams sent to grieving families. Quietly, without speeches or medals, Eli Mercer became one of the most consequential figures in the Battle of the Atlantic, and almost nobody outside a handful of radar rooms knew his name. January-June 1944, North Atlantic Theater. The winter storms of 1944 tore across the North Atlantic like ancient gods settling old grudges. Waves towered over merchant ships, slamming their hulls with mountains of water that dissolved into icy spray. The cold cut through gloves, coats, steel through everything except the relentless Allied will to keep those supply lines moving. This was the artery that kept Britain alive. It had to remain open. But something was different now. On escort after escort, in radar huts drenched in red emergency light, operators leaned forward as faint echoes returned to their scopes ghostly, delicate signatures spaced at 0.0059 to 0.0061 seconds. A year earlier, these microspikes would have been laughed off as jitter. Now, they were warnings. Dangerous ones. Life-saving ones. Convoy HX-208 was the first to realize the transformation was real. On a night when visibility fell below 200 meters, a radioman aboard the frigate HMS Larkspur picked up a familiar double blip barely more than a hiccup in the baseline. He whispered, "Echo Pattern 6 Alpha." Within minutes, escorts swept the suspected bearing with depth charges. Hours later, fishermen recovered debris from a wrecked U-boat. At the next convoy, SC-156, the pattern repeated. At HX-219, it happened again. The U-boats had lost the one weapon they relied on more than torpedoes. Surprise! German Wolfpacks, once infamous for their coordinated nighttime attacks, now found themselves exposed before they could even rise to periscope depth. Their carefully planned intercept angles unraveled. Their spreads failed. Their confidence shattered. In bunkers in Lorient and Street Nazaire, Kriegsmarine officers scrawled new directives across chalkboards. Dive deeper. Coat hulls. Alter ascent profile. Disrupt surface pressure signatures. German engineers scrambled to counter the inexplicable Allied foresight. They coated U-boat hulls with 14mm rubberized sheathing, hoping to dampen pressure waves. They revised approach tactics, ordering captains to attack at sharper angles, deeper dives, slower rise rates. None of it worked. The sea didn't lie. A submarine displaced water, and water reflected truth. Micro-echo spacing persisted unimpressed by rubber coatings, undistracted by deeper approaches. The statistics told the story better than any communiqué. Convoy loss rates, once a catastrophic 27%, plummeted to under 4%. Supply lines that had once bled ships now moved with near impunity across waters that had previously been death traps. Escort captains began to talk about the phenomenon in quiet respect. "You feel it first," one said. "Like the ocean holds its breath, then the echo hits." Another crewman swore he could hear the double heartbeat in his dreams. For Eli Mercer, stationed on board a new destroyer, the shift felt surreal. Where once he had been a lone voice in a room of skeptics, now every operator carried delay charts, pattern cards printed at the Admiralty's order. His technique had become standard issue. No fanfare, no medals, no spotlight. Just a quiet revolution, measured in milliseconds. Historians would later say the Battle of the Atlantic turned in 1944 because of codebreakers, new ships, better convoy tactics. All true. But there was something else, a silent change, almost invisible, hiding in the static. A 0.006-second miracle that denied the Wolfpacks their prey, night after night. The German naval engineers gathered inside a dimly lit warehouse deep within the Kiel Naval Yard, a cold, drafty cathedral of steel beams, riveted submarine hull sections, and the grinding echo of machinery working long past dusk. Outside, U-boats slid into their pens like wounded animals. Inside, the Reich's best technical minds argued over a mystery they could not solve. Something had shifted in the Atlantic. Allied convoys were slipping away untouched. Wolfpack attacks, once perfectly timed, now failed before they began. U-boat captains reported escorts turning toward them before they reached firing depth, sometimes even before their periscope cleared the surface. The fear among the engineers was palpable. "It is impossible," muttered one. "Unless the Allies have invented a new radar," said another. But radar, they believed, could not penetrate seawater. That truth was sacrosanct. On a workbench, surrounded by chalkboards filled with half-erased equations, a captured Allied radar set waited, its casing dented from transport, wires tagged and catalogued by German intelligence. Engineers leaned over it, probing its guts like archaeologists searching for forbidden secrets. At the head of the table, Oberingenieur Klaus Dieter tapped an oscilloscope display. "The Allies have improved their wavelength selection," he declared. "It must be their frequency." He adjusted a dial, attempting to replicate a timing pattern Allied escorts were rumored to use. The magnetron drifted. 3.1 gigahertzes. Not the intended 3 gigahertzes. A tiny deviation. A small miscalibration. Exactly enough to destroy the effect they were trying to replicate. A younger engineer frowned. "And what of these rumors milliseconds between pulses?" Dieter scoffed. "Impossible. Radar cannot detect milliseconds of spacing in ocean clutter. The Americans must be using a filter. Perhaps a new cathode ray amplifier. Something mechanical, not nonsense timing theory." But there was a filter inside the captured radar set, an analog delay line filter carefully built into the circuitry. Germans examined it, puzzled. They documented its shape, its wiring, its passband. But they missed the one thing that mattered. It wasn't a filter for the main signal. It was a filter for the ghost, the micro-echo, the one thing they did not believe existed. Their reverse engineering attempts grew frantic. They altered bandwidths. They adjusted gain. They even tested a prototype snorkel-mounted reflector designed to confuse Allied sets. Nothing changed. Night after night, U-boats radioed the same chilling message. "Escorts found us before periscope depth. Convoys turning before attack." Wolfpack scattered, no launch possible. In Berlin, the Naval High Command concluded the Allies had developed some undocumented aerial reconnaissance method. Others blamed spies, some blamed luck, but they never blamed the timing, never looked at the 6-millisecond echo, never understood what the Allies truly saw. What happened next stunned even Allied intelligence. German engineers, convinced that the secret lay in wavelength alone, invested millions of Reichsmarks redesigning magnetrons, adjusting cavity tunings, and adding snorkel baffles, every solution except the right one. Because the right one wasn't German engineering at all. It was a quiet American radioman, with a notebook full of timings, and the unusual gift of hearing what machines weren't built to hear. USS Kittiwake. Mid-Atlantic Patrol. Fog hung low over the convoy, a damp gray blanket that blurred the horizon into nothingness. The morning routine aboard the Kittiwake was already underway, coffee boiling in dented steel pots, boots clanging across metal grating, engines throbbing beneath the deck like a giant heartbeat. Radar crews rotated through their shifts with bleary eyes and stiff backs. Eli Mercer had been up since dawn. He wiped condensation from the radar console with a rag, the phosphor glow reflecting in his tired eyes. His notebook edges, worn soft from months of sea air, lay open beside him, filled with columns of precise timings. 0.006, 0.0058, 0.0061. 17 entries. 17 moments when a faint ghost in the static had meant the difference between survival and annihilation. But today, as Eli finished recalibrating the gain filter, something struck him, a simple thought, almost embarrassingly small. What happens when I'm not here to hear it? He reached into his locker, pulled out a stub of pencil, and tore a scrap of paper from his notebook. Then, standing on tiptoe, he taped it to the bulkhead just above the radar console. 5 words. Nothing dramatic, nothing scientific. If you hear the double heartbeat, wake the captain. He stepped back. It looked ridiculous, a superstition, a sailor's charm, the kind of thing a green operator might pin up after a night of bad dreams. A seaman walking by chuckled. "What's that?" "Mercer, radar poetry. Just a reminder," Eli muttered. But the other operators read it, smirked at it, mocked it in whispers. A heartbeat echo? A ghost signal? 6 milliseconds? It sounded like folklore. Even the captain, when he passed through that afternoon, raised an eyebrow. "A bit mystical for my taste, Radioman." Eli didn't argue. He didn't need anyone to believe him, not anymore. He only needed them to react if the pattern appeared again. And that night, it did. At 23:47, a junior operator named Lewis nearly spilled his coffee when 2 tight pulses flickered across the screen. 0.006-Second spacing, perfect symmetry. His breath caught. The note above the console stared down at him, illuminated by the dim red lights. Double heartbeat. His hand shot to the talkback key. Bridge, possible subsurface contact, bearing 132. The captain was on the bridge before the sentence finished echoing in the headphones. Escorts maneuvered. Depth charges armed. Within minutes, a U-boat trying to slip into firing position was forced down by a barrage that cracked its stern planes clean off. The convoy never even knew how close death had come. Word spread. Soon, the note on the bulkhead became more than a scrap of paper. It became shipboard lore. Crews swore by it. Some even tapped the bulkhead for luck before taking the console, not because they believed in ghosts, but because they believed in Eli. The boy who heard the sea speak, the radioman who turned a 6-millisecond whisper into a weapon. March 1945, Navy Bureau of Ordnance, Washington, D.C. The war was turning. Everyone knew it. Newspapers blared headlines of Allied advances across Europe. U-boat pens lay smoldering from bombing raids, and the once invincible Wolfpacks were now scattering like shadows at dawn. In Washington, inside the austere walls of the Navy Bureau of Ordnance, officers shuffled through mountains of classified documents, battle summaries, technological assessments, statistical breakdowns, all being compiled into the official record of the Atlantic Campaign. Somewhere within that paper avalanche lay the truth, but it would not survive the sorting process. In a windowless archival room on the 4th floor, a group of senior officers sat around a long table covered with typed reports. They worked silently, red pencils in hand, crossing out paragraphs, tightening language, condensing complex innovations into vague footnotes. This was not malicious, just bureaucratic tradition. Documentation had to look clean, logical, predictable, and nothing about Eli Mercer's discovery fit those rules. A lieutenant paused while reading through a draft appendix. "Here's something unusual: micro-echo spacing associated with subsurface pressure deformation." Whose idea was this? A commander leaned back. "Some radioman, Mercer, claimed radar could detect subs underwater. Admiralty said to keep it discreet." The lieutenant frowned. "But reports show it saved multiple convoys." The commander waved a dismissive hand. "Unverified. Difficult to explain. Can't put superstition in a technical report. Focus on sonar improvements and escort tactics." The red pencil struck the page. One swipe, then another. Entire paragraphs vanished. The annex describing echo timing deleted. The experimental notes from Belfast removed. The tank replications omitted. Eli's memo never referenced. On another table sat a stack of depth charge performance analyses, carefully cited and cross-checked. Right beside them, convoy interception charts highlighting Enigma decrypts. Every tool that fit neatly into the narrative, intelligence breakthroughs, ship design improvements, fleet coordination was celebrated. But a 6-millisecond anomaly discovered by a quiet radioman? It didn't fit the image of organized military brilliance. "This isn't doctrine," one officer said. "It's intuition. Operators hearing what the equipment wasn't supposed to detect." Another added, "Leave it out. We don't want history thinking we relied on ghosts in the static. And just like that, the secret faded. Not out of conspiracy, not out of spite. Simply because the truth was too small, too strange, too human. When the final anti-submarine warfare report went to print in April 1945, there was no mention of Echo Pattern 6 Alpha, no acknowledgement of micro-delay signatures, no reference to the 0.006-second ghost that had saved thousands of lives. Eli Mercer's name appeared nowhere. He was not in the list of contributors, not in the annex, not in the footnotes. He became what wartime bureaucracies so often create, a forgotten hero in the margins of history. Had the officers known what future researchers would uncover, had they realized how deeply those milliseconds mattered, they might have thought twice before striking through his work. But in 1945, with the world racing toward victory, no one had time to reconsider. The secret was buried. The war moved on. And Eli's discovery slipped quietly into silence. Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. The laboratory at Woods Hole buzzed with the clean, electronic hum of modern research. Oscilloscopes, with crisp digital traces, reel-to-reel tape drives humming steadily, the smell of fresh solder replacing the warm dust and ozone of wartime radar rooms. Here, among the tangle of coaxial cables and academic journals, a young oceanographic researcher named Dr. Hannah Kellerman sifted through a stack of newly declassified World War II documents. She had no idea she was about to stumble onto a ghost. Hannah specialized in surface wave propagation, how tiny ripples and pressure disturbances traveled across the ocean. While studying modern sonar interference patterns, she searched back through historical data for early references to similar anomalies. One folder caught her eye, thin, underlabeled, nearly overlooked. Inside were photocopies of obscure Allied radar logs from 1943 and 1944, faded pages of phosphor traces, timing marks, and handwritten annotations from operators long dead. Most were routine. Some were chaotic. But one set of logs made her stop breathing entirely. Across several entries, someone had handwritten, 0.006-second double echo detected. Ghost. Return repeating. Pattern consistent with subsurface displacement. Hannah frowned. Subsurface displacement? Radar? In 1943? That isn't possible. But the traces didn't lie. She cross-referenced the spikes with modern sonar readings she had catalogued the previous month. The match was uncanny, nearly perfect. The war-era radar spikes followed the exact timing signatures, now known to result from pressure wave deformation above submerged objects. Hannah leaned closer, heart pounding with a kind of thrill only a scientist feels when decades suddenly collapse into clarity. This is the same phenomenon, she whispered. She grabbed a notepad and began plotting the spikes with modern resolution. There it was, the signature arc, the precise millisecond spacing, the unmistakable slope of a subsurface hull shifting water upward by 1-2 millimeters. A decades-old note in the margin caught her eye. Operator, Mercer. Just a radioman. No rank, no citation, no attached explanation. But his logs were meticulous timings, down to 4 decimal places. Cross-bearings scribbled in the edges. Hannah felt a chill. Someone heard this. Someone understood it, long before we had the math to prove it. She rushed down the hall, waving the logs. "Greg, you need to see this," she called to a senior researcher. "These World War II radar anomalies, they match modern interference modeling exactly." Greg skimmed them, eyebrows rising. "But radar couldn't detect submarines then." "That's what we thought," Hannah replied, breathless. "But someone noticed. Someone documented it. This radioman Mercer, he saw what no one else did." Greg looked again, slower this time. "What happened next," he said quietly, "might rewrite a small piece of naval history." Over the next months, Hannah's findings spread through academic circles. Papers were published, conferences held, and in a footnote, not unlike the footnotes that once erased him, appeared the first formal recognition that during the war, an unknown operator had detected subsurface reflections decades before the physics was understood. Historians finally asked, who was Eli Mercer? The answer would take years to piece together. But the rediscovery had begun. The forgotten insight had returned from the deep. Modern Analysis Section. For decades, the story of Eli Mercer's discovery lay buried in forgotten logs and faint pencil marks. But once modern researchers revisited the physics behind his 0.006-second echo, something remarkable happened. The impossible suddenly became obvious. The ocean, it turns out, speaks a language of pressure, and radar, under the right conditions, can hear it. Today, engineers walk through the math with a clarity that Eli never had access to. They break it down on clean whiteboards with laser pointers, graphs, and high-speed digital instruments. But even with all of that sophistication, they always begin the same way. Let's start with the deformation. When a submarine travels just beneath the surface, its hull doesn't simply push water aside, it lifts the surface above it by 1–2 millimeters. That tiny rise, almost invisible to the naked eye, changes the reflective geometry of the air-sea boundary. And radar cares deeply about geometry. A standard World War II pulse traveled outward at the speed of light, struck the ocean's surface, and returned. But if the surface was slightly elevated due to a subsurface pressure wave, the return path lengthened by millimeters. A few millimeters of displacement corresponds to delta equals 2dc. Delta t equals FACC 2dc. Delta equals C2d, where d equals vertical displacement of the water surface, c equals speed of light. Plug in 1.03 to 1.12 millimeters, and you get delta is approximately equal to 0.006 seconds, delta t approx 0.006 text seconds. Delta is approximately equal to 0.006 seconds, 6 milliseconds. A delay so small the radar manuals dismissed it as noise. A delay so precise it mirrored the trim adjustment of a diving U-boat. But the miracle wasn't that the physics worked. The miracle was that a human being perceived it. Modern instruments can display these spikes cleanly because they operate with microsecond sampling rates and controlled noise floors. In 1943, a Type 286 radar set sat closer to a glorified lightning detector than a scientific instrument. Its magnetrons drifted. Its gain fluctuated. Sea clutter washed across the display in waves. Yet Eli, sitting in a cramped, leaking hut aboard a destroyer in the middle of a North Atlantic storm, recognized the signature instantly. He didn't need equations. He didn't need digital processing. He heard the spacing, the faint double thump inside the headphones that most operators filtered out as static. Modern analysts who review his logs marvel at this. A senior acoustics professor at Woods Hole later remarked, "What Mercer heard in 1943, we didn't model mathematically until the late 1960 seconds. He was listening to physics we hadn't even described yet." Engineers now understand that micro-echo timing can reveal submarine orientation, depth changes within the upper thermocline, approach velocity, hull displacement pattern, all from a tiny ripple at the surface. Naval architects have since used this knowledge to model stealth signatures, refine sonar cancellation algorithms, and map pressure surface coupling with unprecedented precision. Even modern over-the-horizon radar studies still encounter Mercer echoes unexpected millisecond spikes caused by disturbances below the surface. The breakthrough that saved thousands of lives wasn't mystical. It wasn't luck. It wasn't even radar seeing underwater. It was the ocean telling the truth through a millimeter of lifted water, and the one radioman who listened. He turned physics into intuition, noise into signal, milliseconds into survival. And the world is still catching up to the thing he discovered by accident, in the middle of a war, with nothing more than a restless curiosity and a gift no instrument could match. Epilogue 1996 and beyond. Eli Mercer died quietly in the spring of 1996. No parades, no medals, no speeches from admirals or historians. Just a small gathering in a modest New Jersey church family, a few neighbors, and an aging veteran who remembered serving on the Kittiwake. The obituary mentioned that Eli had been a Navy radioman during World War II, that he enjoyed tinkering with electronics, and that he was survived by 2 nieces. There was no mention of the thousands of sailors whose lives had been saved because of him. After the service, one of his relatives sorted through a small box of belongings: a watch, a few letters, an engineering manual, and a worn notebook with the corners curled and the cover smudged by decades of fingerprints. Inside were hand-drawn timing charts, echo sketches, mathematical scribbles, and delicately penciled entries. 0.006, 0.0058, 0.0061, 0.0059. The last surviving record of a discovery the Navy never celebrated. That notebook eventually made its way to a tiny maritime museum on the Jersey coast. The curator, struck by the mysterious numbers and the faint mention of radar echoes, placed it in a glass case beside a Type 286 display unit. He typed a small placard to accompany it. Just one line. The man who heard what radar could not see. Visitors passed by the case daily, school groups, veterans, hobbyists, most glancing at it without fully understanding what they were looking at. A notebook full of numbers, a quiet face in a faded photograph, a story reduced to a sentence. But occasionally, someone stopped. A retired sonar operator would squint at the timings and mutter, "Impossible." A naval historian would whisper, "Why have I never heard of this?" A student might wonder how one person could notice what entire institutions overlooked. And in those moments, Eli's legacy flickered back to life, just like the ghost echo he once caught on a phosphor screen in the middle of a black, moonless sea. What history failed to record, humanity slowly rediscovered. Because the truth has a way of resurfacing, even decades later. And Eli's truth was simple. A quiet boy from a basement radio repair shop saved men he would never meet, using a sense no textbook could teach, and a discovery no admiral wanted to explain. He didn't do it for glory. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because he could hear something others couldn't, and trusted that faint whisper even when the world told him it was meaningless. In the end, his legacy isn't measured in footnotes. It's measured in lives. Tens of thousands of lives. The Atlantic kept its secrets for decades. But one of them, Eli's secret, finally found its way back to the surface. The story of the Battle of the Atlantic is usually told in sweeping strokes. Convoys stretching to the horizon. Wolfpacks moving like predators through black water. Escorts hammering depth charges into the deep. Admirals speak of strategy. Historians speak of code breaking. Engineers point to new ships, new tactics, new weapons. But beneath all of that, hidden inside the noise of war, lay a single measurement almost too small to matter. 0.006 seconds. A delay so slight it barely registered on 1,940 seconds equipment. A whisper inside a storm. A ghost the Navy never meant to find. And yet, that ghost changed everything. When Eli Mercer leaned over his Type 286 radar console on a moonless night in September 1943, he wasn't holding a weapon. He wasn't commanding a fleet. He wasn't decoding secret messages. He was a radioman undertrained, underestimated, overlooked, listening for something no manual told him to hear. He found it anyway. The micro-echo he detected wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It wasn't guesswork. It was physics, pressure waves lifting the ocean's skin by a millimeter, altering the reflection path just enough to delay a radar echo by 6 milliseconds. A submarine's heartbeat, a signature so faint that experts dismissed it as superstition, noise, hallucination. Eli heard it, believed it, acted on it, and because of that act, because a single operator trusted a detail the rest of the Navy had thrown away, entire convoys survived. Wolfpacks failed. The shipping lanes tightened their armor. Families who would have received telegrams of sorrow instead received homecoming embraces. Historians estimate that 19,480 sailors lived because one man noticed a delay measured in thousandths of a second. Eli never knew that number. He never knew his discovery was rediscovered decades later. He never saw the world try to catch up to the physics he heard long before anyone else understood it. But perhaps that's fitting. Some heroes are meant to be known. Others are meant to be felt, echoes rippling outward through time, changing lives long after their own heartbeat has faded. The war was won by factories, fleets, and strategy, but also by something far smaller. A millimeter of water lifted above a submarine. A pulse delayed by 6 milliseconds. A radioman who listened when others ignored the static. The Atlantic had whispered its warning. Only one man was quiet enough to hear it. And in that miracle of perception, in that fractional blink of time, thousands lived. One tiny echo, one forgotten radioman, one 0.006 second miracle. Fade to black,